So it's a real pleasure to be here giving this presentation. It's relatively new work for me. So a bit about the background on the project. I taught a class on toleration in the fall. One of you was in the class. I've made a rule that when I teach a class, I'm going to try to write a paper. This is a paper that I was writing while I was teaching the class. It's called Freedom of Expression and the Liberalism of Fear. Hopefully those things, the reasons for the title will become clear. Really small print. It's never clear how big it's going to come up on the screen. It says a defense of the darker Mill. Mill is this charming gentleman here. And I am going to be arguing that many of the recent philosophical treatments of freedom of expression neglect a darker side of John Stuart Mill. So first, we live in a strange place. I'm not talking about Wellesley, but rather the United States. The United States is exceptional in a variety of ways. I'm not talking about the refusal to adopt the metric system or anything like that, but we're exceptional specifically concerning freedom of expression. Does anybody know why that is? What's different about being here in this legal environment than, say, in Europe or Canada, other Western countries?
We protect hate speech.
We protect hate speech. Yeah, what else? Anything else? That's one thing. We have this thing called the First Amendment that protects a lot of speech. So you see Homer Simpson's charming front. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech or of the press, or the right of the people peaceably to assemble and to petition the government for a redress of grievances. So it wasn't always this way, but judicial interpretation of this First Amendment has led to the striking down of laws against hate speech. It's led to the striking down of regulations against criticism of public figures, so public libel laws. In general, the only sure things that you can regulate about speech in the United States are time, manner, and place of expression. So think time. Think a guy with a megaphone out at midnight on your street. He probably can't be there. It's a restriction of his freedom of expression in one sense, but it's a content-neutral restriction. Think manner. You get in your private helicopter and drop, thousands of pamphlets on the public park or the national park, the Grand Canyon, whatever. Probably can't speak that way, although it is expression, and place. So there are going to be restrictions on the places that you can exercise your expressive liberties. That having been said, there's relatively few permissible content restrictions on what you can say. That makes us exceptional. And there are a lot of academics in philosophy who think that our exceptionalism, like our exceptionalism in many other areas, metric system, is regrettable. And they would advise that we move away from being exceptional in these ways. Because most philosophical work on freedom of speech has the following general structure. So there's a sort of standard view of rights. Rights protect weighty interests. Right? We have weighty interests in a lot of different things, and granting a general right to freedom of expression is a pretty good way of realizing those interests. What's more is that rights aren't plausibly absolute constraints, and they have limits. And so if you look at the weighty interests that recognizing a right to freedom of speech is supposed to protect, then you can determine what the limits of the right are. So think about some interests that a right to freedom of speech might protect. Democratic deliberation, right? So it allows us to go out in the public sphere and talk to one another, exchange ideas about what politicians could be doing better. So if there's a right to, if we have a weighty interest in free speech because it aids us in the search, in our democratic deliberations, then when silencing or regulating speech does a better job, it's pretty natural to say, well, you should silence or regulate speech. Freedom of speech, freedom of expression aids in the pursuit of truth. Right? This is a Millian sort of argument. There are many reasons that Mill thought if we're free to express our views, we'll do better at reaching the truth than if we're constrained. Right? But there are some sensible regulations on speech and expression that seem like they could just fine-tune and get this to be a little bit better. And if we enshrine the right to free speech originally to aid us in the pursuit of truth, then it looks like that's what we should do. It would be somehow irrational to not regulate speech if the reason that we have the right in the first place is better advanced through regulation than through laissez-faire. Right? So, as Stanley Fish puts the more general point, speech is always produced within the precincts of some conception of the good to which it must yield in the event of conflict. Erwin Chemerinsky, the great Berkeley constitutional law scholar, puts it a little bit differently. Courts must inevitably decide, he says, what speech is protected, under what circumstances, and when and how the government may regulate. But such an analysis is possible only with reference to the goals that freedom of speech, or the weighty interest that freedom of speech is meant to advance or achieve. And the trend in much recent philosophical discussion of freedom of expression is that attention to the goals and interests that freedom of speech is supposed to advance gives us reason to depart from free speech exceptionalism, what I'll call, from this point forward, FSE. So however popular, I think this is exactly the wrong way of looking at things. It's wrong because it gets things the wrong way around. It treats freedom from interference as requiring some sort of special justification rather than the norm. According to the standard view, a principle guaranteeing persons' interference must meet with some sort of special justification. Why don't we get to interfere with you? That's like where the burden of proof lies. There must be some special reason according to which interfering with somebody's expressive liberties is wrong. Now, this is wrong, I say, because there's a very long history of treating liberty as the baseline. Not because it protects or is itself some weighty interest. It is, and it does, but because recorded history tells a story of persons gaining power primarily to impose their vision of the good life upon unconsenting others. Those empowered to interfere have the guns, and the closer we get to arming them with justifications for turning on them who they're supposed to protect, who they are supposed to protect, the sooner we find ourselves on the wrong side of the barrel. We support rights against interference not to realize certain goods, but to protect against the fact that non-interference in others' affairs owes most commonly to lack of power rather than principle. Questions about the general orientation of the talk? Feel free. I'm going to stick a little bit close to the script because some of the stuff I'm discussing is controversial, but that doesn't mean you shouldn't interrupt and get me off the script as you have questions. Get involved. So there are two traditions of liberalism. The first treats the specification of liberal rights as crucially important because they get us lots of great things. Creativity, community, self-expression, autonomy, mutual respect, accommodation for difference. On this kind of view, it's as important to protect persons in their weighty interests by affording them rights as it is to empower governments to limit liberties when their exercise threatens the goals that justify those rights. On the second tradition, the one that has my sympathies, rights are not means for realizing good, but for avoiding certain evils. Rights are political victories, one institutional safeguards, protecting spheres of activity into which interference by powerful government agents is barred. The second view seems to me the right view concerning whether to depart from or further entrench free speech exceptionalism. On this view, the content of liberal rights is determined not by looking at our weighty interests, although this may inspire support for them. I don't mean to say that we get no good things out of protecting rights. but rather by recognizing grounds for abuse and fighting politically to remove the pretenses for abuse. If we're lucky and successful, the result is spheres of freedom around which sufficient support has been rallied to keep others, especially states, from interference. On this account, rights aren't really philosophical entities primarily, but political ones. Although philosophical rights seem to have unavoidably sensible limits, the very point of political rights is to provide protection against a widespread desire to interfere with the lives and purposes of others. Protection that is given adequately in the case of only in the case of absolute prohibitions against legislative excess. They exist not because they're optimal ways of realizing good, flourishing lives, although they're pretty good ways of realizing good, flourishing lives, but because they're good ways of avoiding tyrannical interference. All right, so the latter school of thought, the one to which I'm sympathetic, has been given the name the Liberalism of Fear by the great political theorist Judith Shklar. She grounded it in the thought of Thomas Hobbes, but I'm going to be making the case that it could well be grounded in a darker side of the great John Stuart Mill. So, what's the plan? Oh yeah, so this is Mill. I photoshopped him into a cloak to indicate that it's not the Mill that people typically read, but a darker Mill. I pointed this out, I ran this by some friends, and one of them indicated, well, I think it'll produce effects, it's just not clear whether it's the desired effect, right? So I want you to sympathize with the darker Mill. Maybe he scares you. I don't know. I guess we'll find out. Let me know what you think of the darker Mill. You'll be looking at him a fair amount. So what I'm going to do in the talk is discuss 3 Millian arguments against free speech exceptionalism in favor of greater regulation. Arguments that you're probably familiar with, in part because some Wellesley professors have made some pretty compelling cases for at least one of these arguments. I'm going to try to recover through quoting a bunch of On Liberty and Principles of Political Economy, this beautiful darker Mill that you should all sympathize with and like. And then I'm going to give a dark Millian defense of free speech exceptionalism. So that's the basic plan. So I should, yeah.
Could you just quickly, provide like I guess, succinct definition of free speech exceptionalism?
The next sentence. Free speech exceptionalism, as I understand it, amounts to the view, and this, by the way, is it's basically the status quo in American jurisprudence surrounding free speech, right? But this is what it basically amounts to. And you can fight about whether it amounts to exactly this. But free speech exceptionalism, as I understand it, amounts to the view that a person's liberty not only to form but also to express opinions is sacrosanct. I mean interference with another's expression of an opinion, so far as it really is only expression of an opinion, is not to be interfered with, period. True, some of what is intuitively speech, the production of sounds through the vocal cords, constitutes action. Uttering the words, "you're fired," constitutes an act, firing, which is governed not by norms of free expression, but by employment norms. And so there's a question here about where precisely to draw the line between expressing an opinion and acting, provided you can get that line drawn in the right place. Everything that falls on the side of expressing an opinion, I want to say should be legally allowed, which is different from saying that you should just run your mouth anytime that you can. Defending a right is compatible with recognizing wrongful exercises of that right. Exercises of that right that you shouldn't do. Does that clarify? Mm-hmm. My pleasure. So, free speech exceptionalism rejects laws regulating hate speech and obscenity and useless or misleading speech. That stuff is all protected now. I think we should continue to protect it. So far as we have the opportunity to oppose regulations in these domains, I think we should do it. And I'll explain why. It's certainly not because we can't imagine cases in which they do significant good, because we can. Philosophers are really good at coming up with cases. There are plausible cases in which they in fact have done good over at least short periods of time. I'm going to say we should forego the benefits that we imagine and see for short periods of time, and I'll explain why. Basic story is that they're rejected because they create new powers of regulation on the part of states that we might reasonably fear will be turned against us, the weak and vulnerable in particular. So here are the three arguments that I think people have given recently. There's one that's conspicuously absent that probably you'll bring up in the Q&A, but we can talk about that. I just think it needs a different treatment. So in a recent law review article, Brian Leiter, the Chicago law and philosophy professor, argues that if much non-mundane, that is weighty speech were suppressed, little of actual value would be lost to the world. That's a quote from his paper in 2016 in a law review. Leiter's focus is restricted to speech that concerns matters of, quote, political and moral urgency, speech that purports to be of aesthetic value, speech that purports to help us understand the truth about matters of societal importance, and restricts the relevant sort of value speech might have to epistemic value. That's value in getting to the truth, knowledge value. Even concerning weighty speech, little of value Leiter thinks is lost with the restriction of much actual speech meeting this description. And the gains are potentially enormous. Protecting all speech equally in roughly laissez-faire, exceptionalist fashion results in a free-for-all in which reason is drowned out by nonsense. If you want to motivate Leiter's view, just read the comments section of any news article and notice how awful it seems. Leiter points out that courtroom norms are kind of instructive in this respect. So what's a courtroom supposed to do? It's supposed to, at the end of the day, produce the proper verdict, say, in a criminal court, guilty, not guilty. But notice how restrictive the norms of expression are in the courtroom. Right? There are very well-defined rules for presenting and refuting evidence. And it's plausible to think that if you just had a courtroom in which anyone could say whatever they wanted, you're going to have kind of a bad time getting to the result you want. I think this is plausible. The basic view, I think, can be summarized. Philosophers, we like three-step arguments. They're good. Is basically, that's Brian Leiter up there. This is my old teacher, David Brink. He has a slightly moderated version of this view. And basically, the idea is we should accept free speech exceptionalism only if it promotes epistemic value or democratic self-government. And then the empirical claim, like, look around, it doesn't seem to be doing those things. And concludes that we shouldn't accept the exceptionalism. We should move toward a more restrictive set of norms for speech. So it should be clear that, is it clear to everyone why this argument sort of conforms to the standard view I sketched earlier? Does that fit? Right? So you've got a weighty interest in democratic self-government and epistemic value. Free speech norms are supposed to, or speech norms, whatever they may be, are supposed to protect that. Laissez-faire doesn't do it, so we should have something else. That's kind of the view that I described. I got a thumbs down next to the first premise. I don't think the second premise is implausible on certain interpretations. I think there are cases, you have to make lots of unrealistic assumptions, but there are cases where you can imagine regulations on speech that do better in terms of epistemic value. But I think it's pretty plausible that laissez-faire, looking at the comment section, at least on some interpretations, is not optimal. But I think the problem is with premise one, and I'll explain why later. All right, so the second Millian argument I'm going to call, this is the argument from Cacophony, by the way, because it's like lots of noisy voices, lots of nonsense. This is to say much unmediated, non-mundane speech has little epistemic value, often amounting to little more than, quote, the endless repetition of silly opinions. This is what Brian Leiter thinks of the public sphere as it's currently constituted. So the second argument I call the objection from silencing. Following Catherine McKinnon, the legal scholar, Mary Kate McGowan, Alexandria Edelman, Sarah Helmers, and Jacqueline Stolzenberg affirm the view that minimally a free speech principle is supposed to protect citizens' interest in communicating freely. The problem is that those interests conflict. Protecting the interest to speak of some, for example, pornographers and racists, involves effectively denying others, for example, women and minorities, the effective ability to communicate. Some speech, by its very nature, silences, they argue. Here's a quote that sort of sums up the view. If pornography and silences women, and hate speech silences minorities who are the targets of such hate speech, and if silencing violates the free speech right, then the very free speech reasons for protecting these kinds of speech are also reasons to regulate it. In this way, the silencing argument turns the free speech discussion on its head. So kind of a clever and compelling argument. So this is Mary Kate McGowan, a great Wellesley professor. She's really awesome. You should get to know her. And this is Catherine McKinnon, the great legal scholar who made a bunch of steps toward regulating pornography in the late part of the 20th century. Really interesting stuff. It's a little bit difficult to pin this view down because there are so many different versions of it. So Professor McGowan is prolific. She writes a lot of things. Each paper she writes has a slightly different angle. But roughly, I think this too sort of conforms to the standard view. We have some sort of weighty interest that free speech is supposed to protect, and sometimes that interest points in the other direction, namely for regulation. Like the first argument, the thumbs down indicates that I'm not myself pleased with the first premise. I'll explain why later. Does everyone sort of understand this argument? Yeah. All right. There's more to be said, obviously, but hopefully that gives you a general idea. The third objection sort of combines insights from the first two. Neutrally protecting the rights to speak of the weak and powerful together, like neutrally, ensures effectively that power asymmetries reproduce themselves. Take, for example, the problem of climate change. Right. It is well known that popular opinion radically departs from expert opinion concerning the question of whether human actions have contributed to the warming of the Earth. But as Catriona McKinnon, different McKinnon, notes, this is likely due in part to the proliferation of misinformation on the part of, quote, an established international network of well-funded organizations devoted to organizing climate change denial. In working to raise doubts about the surety of climate research, these powerful organizations can often drown out more informed scientific opinion and exert undue influence on the minds of voters and citizens. This not only impedes the pursuit of truth, but it also leaves the least powerful with the least voice. So this is Catriona McKinnon. She's in the UK. This is the late Herbert Marcuse. Been following him around the world for a long time. Is a great sort of intellectual mind of the New Left. So this argument goes, we should accept the status quo, that is something like free speech exceptionalism, if only if, it wasn't if and only if, I've decided to go with only if doing so is consistent with equal citizenship and the integrity of informational sources. Accepting the status quo is not consistent with these values, and so we shouldn't accept the status quo. Yeah, so the conclusion of McKinnon's piece on this is that climate change denialism isn't to be tolerated. I think there's much vicious in climate change denialism, but I think we're better off tolerating it. I'll explain why, but as is the sort of pattern, it's got to do with the first premise. Let me just say a few words about why I think all of these responses to free speech exceptionalism are essentially Millian responses. Does anyone know Mill's defense of free expression? How it proceeds? What is it? Is anyone familiar? No? Okay, so he has basically two arguments. So one of them is an epistemic argument. This is the most famous one. Mill says, it's always possible that the claim that you end up suppressing is true. We're just fallible. Second, Truth's collision with error. So when the received view, the view that's not being suppressed but is rather doing the suppressing, is right, even the people who are already in possession of the truth gain something by engaging with error, right? If you never have the opportunity to argue with someone who genuinely disagrees with you, you possess the truths that you possess, not as knowledge, but as dead dogma. Right? What he means by that is it's sort of an empty shell. You don't know the grounds for it. You don't really understand why it's true. You just understand that it's true. Mill's clear that this can be a sign of progress, but it's also the case that for reasons of democratic deliberation, you want a citizenry that's in possession of the grounds of the truths that it holds. Okay? And the third thing is that lots of things, even if they're not true, are at least half true. So when you disagree with someone, they're human beings. They're not like living on Mars. They've got some reasons. They might be fundamentally misguided, but you can learn from them nevertheless. All right? So these are the Millian grounds. I think basically these three arguments, in some sense, the second one is the least easy fit here, are consonant with this Millian picture. What they point out is that Mill's own reasons for preferring a regime of free speech, free expression, also suggests reasons for regulation. So Mill writes on Liberty that even opinions lose their immunity when the circumstances in which they are expressed are such as to constitute a positive instigation to some mischievous act. And what I take it the three people who are making these arguments are doing is to point out that Mill's own rationale for enshrining expressive liberties point to reasons for regulation that go beyond positive instigation to some mischievous act. Okay, so it's very dark, Mill. So I wanted to, I like him. He's really in the shadows. Anyway, so I'm going to tell you about, I think, a neglected side of the beginning of On Liberty. And it's going to involve a lot of quoting from Mill, so I hope you'll bear with me. But I think the quotes are kind of cool. Hopefully you'll find them interesting. So Mill begins On Liberty with what he takes to be a plausible history of political power. So where it came from, why we have it, how we got to where we are today. At first, political power was acceded to because it offered the vulnerable protection from the strong. Mill puts the point this way: to protect the weaker members of the community from being preyed upon by innumerable vultures, it was needful that there should be an animal of prey stronger than the rest. The animal of prey that's stronger than the rest is what? The state, yeah. Its creation brings new dangers. It's an animal of prey, even though it offers protection for the weak and vulnerable. Quote, just as the king of the vultures would be no less bent upon preying on the flock than any of the minor harpies, it was indispensable to be in a perpetual attitude of defense against his beak and claws. What did we get from the perpetual attitude of defense? We got the beginning of rights and liberties held against the state. Quote, certain immunities which it was regarded as a breach of duty in the ruler to infringe. So the ruler does something wrong if they violate these rights and liberties. But also constitutional checks on the power of the state to ensure that these immunities are adequately respected, so an assurance mechanism. In time, these checks on state power were supplemented by representative government, democracy, something like that, making it appear that the state and the people subject to it were one, and that the state, being constituted by the people, could not harm them. The nation, in Mill's words, no longer appeared to need protection against what it saw as its own will. What once served as protections against tyranny now appeared to be shackles on the self-legislative capacity of the general will. All right, so what are all these rights and liberties? They're stopping us from expressing our political will through the state. Mill, for his part, is a little bit more, he's a great fan of representative government. He wrote a book called On Representative Government, in which he argued that basically moves toward representative government would solve most of the problems that afflict persons in their pursuit of civic virtue. But still, self-government spoken of is not the government of each by himself, but of each by all the rest, Mill says, and can just as well be tyrannical. Mill predicted that gradually skepticism of government would erode because of the expanse of representative government, which he regards as a good expansion. Okay, so this is all reasonably well-trodden terrain. Where things get a little bit darker yet is Mill's account of human nature. So Mill reports that human beings are given to believe that it is generally completely unnecessary to offer reasons for interfering with others. Quote, that their feelings on subjects of this nature are better than reasons and render reasons unnecessary. So, you know, why should you interfere with that person isn't even a question. The question is, well, that person's doing something that makes me feel bad, so I want to stop them from doing it. In general, a person's ground for restricting some behavior run no deeper than, quote, the feeling that everybody should be required to act as he, so a widespread desire for conformity. In the best scenarios, persons are prepared to, quote, appeal to a similar preference felt by other people. We around here think you shouldn't be doing that. Those in charge consider questions of, quote, what things society ought to dislike or like without considering whether society's likings or dislikings should be a law to individuals. Even in the one case, so Mill's writing after the Lutheran Reformation. Do folks know what the Lutheran Reformation was?
100 Theses.
So Luther wrote the 100 Theses. He was a theologian. He railed against the Roman Catholic Church selling of salvation. So he went around saying, hey, if you give us some money for the church, we'll wipe the sins clear. And Luther's like, what? You can't just wipe the sins clear by letting people buy salvation? That's not what this is about. And he ended up getting a lot of popular support. And the church fractured. There became lots of different branches of the church. The universal church lost its universality. And eventually, and there were lots of religious wars, lots of fighting. It wasn't a peaceful time. But eventually it became peaceful. Right? Eventually it yielded what we have now, which is basically mutual toleration among, between different sects. But it wasn't like that in the beginning. So Mill sees this emergence of mutual toleration in a particularly pessimistic light. He does see it as the one case in which individuals' freedom has appeared principled, right? Those who first, this is another quote, broke the yoke of what called itself the universal church, did tolerate eventually other religions, other interpretations, right? But the ones who first broke the yoke were in general as little willing to permit difference of religious opinion as the church itself. The age of religious toleration resulted from churches realizing that it was simply better to limit, quote, their hopes to retaining possession of the ground they already occupied than vying for power over the rest. Put differently, quote, minorities, seeing that they had no chance of becoming majorities, were under the necessity of pleading to those whom they could not convert for permission to differ. Even apparently principled religious toleration comes about less for reasons of principle and more for a want of power on the part of basically all groups to pursue the modes of intolerance that they like best. For Mill, the point is perfectly general. Intolerance is so natural to mankind that what tolerance there is bound to be unprincipled, just for a want of power. So that's sort of the quote, that's a bunch of quotes to give you an idea of why I think Mill is pessimistic, why he's a little bit darker than he's painted. The picture he paints is one according to which human beings are meddlesome biased in their own favor, afraid of and often hostile to difference, who view the means of social and legal control as tools for ensuring that others live according to their model, and who espouse principle only when they predict that doing so will protect them from interference by others who are in fact stronger. He connects these issues specifically to the matter of free expression in the Principles of Political Economy, where he writes, although freedom both of opinion and of discussion is admitted as an axiom in all free countries, this apparent liberality and tolerance has acquired so little of the authority of a principle that it is always ready to give way to the dread or horror inspired by some particular sort of opinions. When it does give way, the government is afforded greater power for intervention, which is concerning, for, quote, every increase of the functions devolving on the government is an increase of its power, both in the form of authority and still more in the form of indirect influence. And democratic accountability offers at best thin protection against such usurpation. Elected representatives are, quote, quite as ready when they think they can count on popular support as any organs of oligarchy to assume arbitrary power. Mill concludes that, quote, laissez-faire should be the general practice, holding at the same time that every departure from it, unless required by some great good, is a certain evil. Mill exhorts readers to be principled, at the very same time that his account of human nature throws cold water on any thought that they might comply. His pessimism on this front, which constitutes what I've called his darker side, and have depicted in this questionable way, leads him to adopt the view that the strong default position ought to be liberty, and that the case for interference must be based on a great good that can be obtained only by means of the interference. The emerging Mill is a partial Mill, right? There are other aspects to his thought. It's the same Mill that claims that, quote, interference of government is with about equal frequency improperly invoked and improperly condemned. So there are some people who are enthusiasts that government shouldn't do anything, and some people who think that it should do everything, and they're both wrong. It is the same Mill whose mode of argumentation strongly suggests that the objections to free speech exceptionalism canvassed earlier are sound Millian objections. For those objections appear to proceed precisely by noting that departure from the norm of laissez-faire in the domain of speech is required by some great good, right? For surely greater realization of truth and the fair and equal value of the liberty of speech for the vulnerable as against the powerful are great goods. They are. Just as surely as his intervention in the laissez-faire of the so-called marketplace of ideas a prima facie plausible way of realizing those goods. Yeah. Now, Mill can't have it both ways, I think. It can't both be that humans are seldom principled actors, that they frequently use whatever means in their power to impose their vision of the good and the right on people who disagree, and that it is sound practice to create institutional structures that give the powerful increased authority to do just that, merely for the sake of pursuing some good. For even if we grant that some proposed regulation on speech is grounded in principle rather than a desire to avoid being dominated by a stronger other, still laws don't determine their applications. People do. It's all well and good to note that as a philosophical matter, there are sensible reasons to restrict speech. The standing powerful defeater of those reasons is simply that political actors are powerful human beings, at best accountable to majorities and counter-majoritarian mechanisms composed of more people that are imperfect human beings, and that qua human beings they use principles and apply them opportunistically. In view of the darker Mill, I think the problem with the three objections to free speech exceptionalism is not that a regime of free speech is an optimal way of pursuing truth. It's not that some person's speech can never deprive others of voice. And it's definitely not that a regime of free speech will be egalitarian in its results. The primary problem with each of these arguments is not in their second premises, but in their first premises, each of which makes clear that free speech exceptionalism is to be accepted only in the case that it optimally advances some interest. Instead, speech is to be protected because regulation, for the purpose of promoting certain interests, provides powerful state actors with a reason for interfering into individual lives. Okay, so The Darker Mill's views on human nature are sufficiently dark, I think, that what we can all agree is a risk, namely that laws and regulations on speech approaches the status of a decisive factor. Mill might be wrong, he might not be wrong, but that's what I think the implication of his darker side is. To the degree that we have successfully coordinated around a legal regime that protects wide spheres of free speech, we should be remiss to depart from it, even given the prospect of realizing some great good. The problem, so as Ronald Cass put the point some decades ago, protection of speech encodes a fear of certain ill-defined and disparate government actions rather than a promise to realize positive goods. Therefore, the starting point, quote, is not what is good about speech. Instead, the initial question is what were the worries about government control of speech in the first place? Such an outlook coheres well, I think, with what Judith Shklar calls the liberalism of fear. So here we've got Justice Hugo Black. He's a sort of hero of mine. He's the one justice who has said that the First Amendment's protection of speech should be absolute. He's cited basically only for the purpose of saying, what a ridiculous view. I think there's probably a version of that that could be worked out and might be right. This is Judith Shklar herself, and that's Ronald Cass up there, who I just quoted. So the liberalism of fear would direct our attention not to what we might achieve by restricting speech, but to what we risk when we empower people to carry out the restrictions. So this is a lengthy quote from her 1989 essay, which is a great essay and everybody should read. The liberalism of fear worries about the excesses of official agents at every level of government, and it assumes that these are apt to burden the poor and weak most heavily. The history of the poor compared to that of the various elites makes that obvious enough. The assumption, amply justified by every page of political history, and we'll talk about some of those pages briefly, shortly, is that some agents of government will behave lawlessly and brutally in small or big ways most of the time, unless they're prevented from doing so. Liberalism of fear doesn't deny power asymmetries between private citizens. It doesn't deny that much speech is of itself worthless or counterproductive or harmful, or that these facts are social objects of concern, sensible objects of concern. It simply notes that providing government agents with additional powers to interfere is an odd medicine. As Shklar puts it a bit later in the essay, while the sources of social oppression are indeed numerous, none has the deadly effect of those who, as agents of the modern state, have unique resources of physical might and persuasion at their disposal. In my view, inspired by Shklar, the late Black, Cass, and the darker Mill, we should embrace free speech exceptionalism and reject calls for speech restrictive legislation. If we accept the liberalism of fear, we focus not on the goods that can be realized by protecting or interfering with some sphere of activity, but the evils that empowering someone to promote ideals through the restriction of speech invites. And I think there's a reply to this which says, haha, all evils can be reframed as privations of goods, and so in terms of them, and all goods can be reframed as absences of evils and in terms of them, and so this is really a distinction without any difference. I think there's a version of this which is right. Language is pliable in that way. And I think the difference in framing makes a real difference to thinking about these issues. Liberals of fear focus not on the ways in which speech is good, but on the reasons why speech is the kind of thing that people want to interfere with. Fearful liberals understand that restricting speech more than restricting action can aid to achieve conformity in thought, and it is therefore important to keep the tools of restrictions out of the hands of the powerful. They understand that moral psychology teaches us that for beings like us, diversity is difficult, and this difficulty often leads us to want to snuff it out. They recognize that because we disagree about the normative facts, a restriction on speech for a good reason, a genuinely good reason, looks to a person who disagrees indistinguishable from an arbitrary restriction. In turn, since we're imperfect precedent-based thinkers, we look to the past in determining what should happen in the future. Those who think that the restriction was unjust will seek to restrict others' speech in actually unjust ways as soon as they can gain power as a means of retaliation. Already there are some who would not allow speech by conservatives. Marcuse, a great intellectual of the New Left that I had up there earlier, famously called for the complete repression of views that would oppose the extension of New Deal policies. Suppose that such a restriction, or even a more sensible one on some of the truly vicious climate change denialism that we see in the public sphere, were to win legislative favor. Just to ask what would happen. It may have epistemic benefits in the short term, right? That speech is no longer out there. People are inundated with good science instead. But in the long term, those silenced and those who agree with those who are silenced are likely to respond in kind, to vie for political power, admit that restrictions on speech are necessary, and admitted by opponents anyway, and to ensure that they get just the restrictions they want. By hypothesis, these restrictions won't be the right ones. They won't. Now, I think there's good reason to be skeptical of a lot of the stuff that I've said. Let me go through some reasons, right? One reason is just that we already have ample proof of the possibility of overcoming the darker side of human nature. Even the exceptional United States has triumphed in this respect. First Amendment freedoms have never included the freedom to incite to illegal activity. Restrictions on fighting words have been applied reasonably impartially. And I think both of those things are false. I mean, it's true that it's never been protected to incite to illegal activity. It's true that fighting words aren't protected speech. Fighting words being like, we'll talk about some fighting words, they're graphic. Things that are likely to involve somebody in a physical altercation. But it's false that these have been applied reasonably impartially. And the second reason is that many European countries and Canada have enacted restrictions on speech that go well beyond our exceptional sphere, our exceptional restrictions, and are worded precisely enough as to be implemented without abuse. So let's talk about the cases. So to clarify the response briefly, like Catherine McKinnon explicitly considers this in her piece arguing for legislation on pornography. She says, look, there's a risk that things will be abused, but those risks have to be assessed against the risks of the status quo, what we're doing right now. And you would have to take my arguments really unseriously to think that those risks were negligible. But if you're a liberal of fear, you just think that we shouldn't undertake the calculation at all, that fear should win the day from the get-go, and that just seems wrong. Okay, so skeptics of exceptionalism, people who advance these three arguments that I've been talking about to this point, are quick to remind readers that the US, as a matter of doctrine, allows for regulation of speech. They cite, like, really enthusiastically Oliver Wendell Holmes' claim that there is no protected liberty to shout fire in a theater and cause a panic. I think there's a deep irony in their citing of this claim, right? It does motivate the idea that speech is not an absolute right. Right? It does seem plausible that you can't yell fire in a crowded theater. But it's ironic because these words are drawn from a case pursuant to the Espionage Act of 1917. Anyone know what this is? Well, we'll learn about it. So in this case, the plaintiff, Charles Schenck, the then General Secretary of the American Socialist Party, distributed a pamphlet to draftees. This is, I think, is kind of brilliant, encouraging them to claim their 13th Amendment rights against enslavement, 13th Amendment against enslavement, right, and evade the draft. I mean, I think it's a pretty brilliant argument against the draft. He was convicted for conspiracy to violate the Espionage Act to conspire against the US government, and appealed the Supreme Court claiming violation of his First Amendment rights. Right? This is to give you a sense of how far we've come in our exceptionalism. Because Wendell Holmes, who makes this claim in this case about shouting fire in a crowded theater, votes to uphold the conviction. It's unanimous. Right? Schenck's document, circulated as it was in wartime, intended as it was to have the effect of obstructing the draft, constituted an attempt to incite to illegal activity. Schenck's speech was in this case asserted by Holmes to be the analog of shouting fire in a crowded theater. In its decision, the court confirmed unanimously. Second case, same principle. Holmes again delivers the opinion of the court. Frowerk, he's a German guy, versus the United States. So Jacob Frowerk published a series of articles criticizing the US's involvement with World War I. Imposed penalties, including jail time, under the Espionage Act of 1917. Given the facts as they were, Holmes concluded, and I quote, It was simply impossible to say that it might not have been found, this is great language, that it might not have been found that the circulation of the paper was in quarters where a little breath would be enough to kindle a flame, and that the fact was known and relied upon by those who sent the paper out. So we don't know if he distributed this information or distributed this newspaper in a place where it was likely to cause other people to commit acts of violence. And since we don't know how strong the government's evidence was, conviction has to be upheld. All right, so two things to notice about these early cases. All right, the first thing is they upheld convictions under the Espionage Act that seem just independently of any constitutional issues. This is where I get to be a philosopher. Just unjust. In both cases, minority socialist opinions, in fact unlikely to pose any real danger to anyone, were suppressed to promote an atmosphere of unity surrounding the state's interests. The court trusted in a way that it should not have trusted the government's judgment that the relevant speech posed, quote, a clear and present danger that the state's repression of speech justifiably sought to avert. Clear and present danger, shouting fire in a theater. In other words, the clear and present danger test, placed in the hands of real-world authorities, led to the repression of speech that ought not to have been repressed, and the wrongful imprisonment of individuals whose rights to speak ought to have been protected. For critics to cite Holmes's words with approval is, I think, a little bit odd, for the context in which these words were delivered displays quite clearly the true grounds of free speech exceptionalism: fear of abuse and inappropriate restriction of speech. All right. So this era of jurisprudence surrounding the espionage was short-lived, somewhat short-lived. It was slow to change, though. Standing by these earlier decisions at the same time that he seems to contradict them, Holmes began to shift the tide of judicial opinion in a more speech-protective direction. So he delivered the dissenting opinion in Abrams versus the United States. This case, 5 individuals printed and distributed pamphlets advocating the end of capitalism and the unity of workers' interests across the globe. The pamphlet especially encouraged the end of American intervention in Russia. While the court majority following Justice Clark upheld these convictions for the distribution of these pamphlets, Holmes demurred, claiming that there was no clear and present danger in this case. Why? Nobody can really figure out why he decided. There's actually a great book. There's a speaker at this event last year who presented a talk on his great book about the circumstances surrounding his reversal on these issues. It's fascinating stuff. He claims that the marketplace in ideas is worth protecting, even when there's some risk of danger. In Gitlow versus New York, Gitlow was indicted for the statutory crime of criminal anarchy. He published a manifesto in the Revolutionary Age advocating for violent revolution and decrying moderate socialism that worked on the margins. So socialism is proceeding too slowly. We need to violently. This is how quickly things are changing. Delivering the opinion of the court, Justice Sanford wrote that, quote, a state in the exercise of its police power may punish those who abuse the freedom of expression by utterances inimical to the public welfare, tending to corrupt public morals, incite to crime, or disturb the public peace. Sanford argued that the state was to judge the regulations required in the pursuit of these interests, and that, quote, every presumption is to be indulged in favor of the validity of the statute. Wow, that's not exceptional. And so we weren't always exceptional. Justice Holmes and Brandeis dissented, holding in this case that there's no clear and present danger. They're restricting now the government's right to interfere. Exceptionalism is sort of starting to emerge, but there's still 2 versus 7 in these cases. So change would be ultimately rather slow. Continuing its pattern of upholding wrongful convictions, the McCarthy-era court famously upheld the constitutionality of the Smith Act. The Smith Act held that it was a criminal offense to belong to a group that advocated or to advocate oneself for the violent overthrow of the government. This is Dennis versus United States. It wasn't until Brandenburg that the clear and present danger test was construed in a sufficiently narrow way. They say it moved to be a different test, but they still use the language of clear and present danger in the decisions. Construed in a sufficiently narrow way by a majority of justices to overturn wrongful convictions and strike down unjust regulations on speech. So this is pretty late. Okay, so and it's a strange case too. In Brandenburg, a KKK rally was deemed protected against the Ohio criminal syndicalism statute. Under the statute, a KKK member was found guilty of, quote, advocating the duty, necessity, or propriety of crime, sabotage, violence, or unlawful methods of terrorism as a means of accomplishing industrial or political reform, and for, quote, voluntarily assembling with any group or assemblage of persons formed to teach or advocate the doctrines of criminal syndicalism. I don't know how to pronounce that word. Anyway, the court ruled Ohio's statute must be struck down. For the first time, right, in 1969, the government is now clearly held to be incapable of restricting speech so far as this stops short of, quote, preparing a group for violent action and stilling it to such action. So now it's clear and present danger that you might be in a condition to ignite a flame. Now it's like actually you have to be there telling somebody with the gun to undertake the crime. The test articulated in Brandenburg was similarly applied to a case in the early 80s surrounding the NAACP's boycott of racist white-owned businesses. A consortium of white-owned businesses claimed damages in response to the boycott, which they were awarded by the lower courts. The NAACP claimed in response that assessing, and rightly by the way, that assessing damages in this way violated their First Amendment right to peaceably assemble for political change. At issue in this case was whether the NAACP's boycott was protected by the First Amendment, given that some speech associated with the boycott constituted incitement to illegal activity. To give you an example, an NAACP official stated in a meeting that, quote, if we catch any of you going into any of them racist stores, we're going to break your damn necks. The court rightly held that the fact that some associated speech was unprotected under fighting words does not entail that the entire boycott must also be deemed unprotected, and that in any case the relevant speech, that is, we're going to break your damn necks, failed to meet the test set out in Brandenburg, right, for identifying unprotected speech. The decision of the lower courts was reversed thusly. So in these cases, the court's reasoning kind of follows a general pattern. Look, there's no absolute right to free speech. That's crazy. Nobody would think that. I kind of do, but nobody would think that. The state has an interest in regulating the speech that endangers the general welfare. The test is clear and present danger, or increasingly narrow as the case might be. The issue for me is that depending who's on the bench and what they're going through in their personal lives, if you look at the case of Justice Holmes, the basic pattern of reasoning yields radically different results. Some courts manage to protect speech that should be protected against state regulation, and others not, right? Since our justice system is precedent-based, the result of the particular direction of the court has been to press in the direction of greater protection of speech. Right? This is in large part where our current exceptionalism comes from. It's worth noting how delicate a fact that is. Schenck, the first case under the Espionage Act, that's never been overturned. It's good law. The U.S. doctrine of failing to protect fighting words, also invoked by free speech exceptionalism skeptics, is similarly strange. So take the case of the famous Chaplinsky versus New Hampshire. All right, this was a case in 1942. New Hampshire had a statute that read as follows: no person shall address any offensive, derisive, or annoying, really, word to any other person who is lawfully in any street or other public place, nor call him by any offensive or derisive name, nor make any noise or exclamation in his presence and hearing with intent to deride, offend, or annoy him, or to prevent him from pursuing his lawful business or occupation. It's a really restrictive law. Lots of things annoy me, like people asking me if I like comedy in New York. I don't know if anyone's been to New York. You like comedy? No. Yes, but not today. The court upheld this law and convictions under it. It reported, quote, there are certain well-defined and narrowly limited classes of speech, the prevention and punishment of which has never been thought to raise any constitutional problem. These include the lewd and obscene, the profane, the libelous, and the insulting, or fighting words, those that by their very utterance inflict injury or tend to incite an immediate breach of the peace. The language there, by the way, is quite close to some of the hate speech laws in Germany. And And go check those out if you'd like. The irony is that though Chaplinsky remains good law and has never been reversed, the court has never again upheld a fighting words regulation on speech, ever. So they've reversed convictions under these laws, but they've never overturned Chaplinsky. To do this, the court has either held that fighting words doctrine applies, this is a quote, applies only to speech directed at another person that is likely to produce a violent response. So, you know, some of the speech just isn't like that. Or that the fighting words legislation in question is just broad or vague or impermissibly restricts content of speech. For me, it's not really hard to see why these regulations are often dismissed by courts as unconstitutionally broad or vague. Consider the court's reasoning in Gooding versus Wilson. In Fulton County, Georgia, Section 266303 provides that any person who shall, without provocation, use to or of another, and in his presence use opprobrious words or abusive language tending to cause a breach of the peace, shall be guilty of a misdemeanor. Gooding was indicted for uttering, among others, the words, "White son of a bitch, I'll kill you," to a police officer who was attempting to restore order. Justice Brennan, delivering the opinion of the court, argued that, quote, "the dictionary definitions of opprobrious and abusive give them greater reach than fighting words." The irony is that in the original Chaplinsky ruling, this concerned a statute that prohibited words intending to annoy another person, and surely annoyance reaches no less far than opprobrium, right? These are just both overly broad. With these words, the entire jurisprudential basis for refusing constitutional protection for fighting words is basically undone. It becomes very difficult to uphold convictions for this rationale. Gooding is one of many cases in which the court veers strongly in a direction that makes it difficult for governments to regulate fighting, for our government to regulate, and state governments to regulate fighting words. Indeed, pertaining both to fighting words doctrine and the incitement doctrine, the court failed initially to protect citizen speech until it tied its own hands by making it nearly impossible to characterize these classes of speech as unprotected, and hence we have free speech exceptionalism. And if you're like me, you celebrate these trends, right? They're good trends. Speech, even that which has the effect of leading others to commit violence, shouldn't be restricted by law. The violence should be restricted by law. The history that has brought it about that very little of such speech is capable of restriction is long and winding, and strongly suggests that Mill was correct to worry that anything shy of absolute protection in the domain of speech was asking for trouble. I think it's not crazy to look at these risks and say that they're tolerable. I think it's a little bit crazy, but I think I can see smart people thinking this. And I don't think that there's anything in being skeptical of exceptionalism that requires that you celebrate these early convictions under, say, the Espionage Act. And so I think that the better course for the skeptic of free speech exceptionalism isn't to look at the US, but to look at places like Europe and Canada. To look at attempts here to regulate speech in ways that are different than this. Okay, so there are two cases that I'll discuss. The first is the case of legislation proposed by McKinnon, Professor McKinnon, that attempted to regulate pornography. And the second is some of the hate speech legislation that's going on in the rest of the world. So Catherine McKinnon and Andrea Dworkin in the late 20th century, the late 80s, early 90s, proposed some legislation that would regulate pornography, understood as follows. This is the graphic sexual, this is, by the way, graphic. This is the graphic sexually explicit subordination of women through pictures or words that includes women dehumanized as sexual objects, things, or commodities, enjoying pain, humiliation, or rape, being tied up, cut up, mutilated, bruised, or physically hurt, in postures of sexual submission or servility or display, reduced to the body parts, penetrated by objects or animals, or presented in scenarios of degradation, injury, torture, shown as filthy or inferior, bleeding, bruised, or hurt in a context that makes these conditions sexual. On McKinnon's proposal, it becomes an actionable civil offense to traffic in pornography, so understood. The ordinance was briefly enacted in Indianapolis. It was swiftly struck down. Amicus briefs, these are briefs that are written by a bunch of concerned parties. So new legislation happens, a bunch of people get concerned, they get organized, they write briefs trying to explain what's concerning about the legislation. They emphasize that the ordinance refusal to include exceptions for work with redeeming social or artistic value rendered it the case that classic works like Ulysses and the Iliad seemed to satisfy the definition. Ultimately, the court would agree and was of the opinion that the extreme restrictions on the content of speech entailed by the definition were sufficient to render the provisions unconstitutional. The defender of similar provisions might note that the relevant law might be more narrowly construed, but, and I think this is really important, for it to be more narrowly construed is for its reach to be truncated and for the purpose of the restrictions to be less ably achieved by their means. So as you make language more precise, it can reach less speech. As it reaches less speech, it prevents less of the stuff that you want to prevent. So I'm not saying that you can't work out the perfectly worded legislation that's not going to be prone to abuse in something like this, but I do want to raise some reasons for doubt. Okay? But you might say, okay, that was maybe not the right way of going. We have hate speech laws in places like Canada and Europe. Germany, France, England, these all have hate speech legislation. And these are maybe narrowly construed. Maybe they're effective in better promoting the goals of a free society. In Canada, the relevant provision reads as follows. Everyone who, by communicating statements other than in private conversation, willfully promotes hatred against any identifiable group is guilty of an indictable offense and is liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 2 years, or an offense punishable on summary conviction. Now, there are exceptions, important exceptions that narrow the reach of this law. Still, it appears capable of being abused, but there have been actually, relatively in Canada, relatively few reports of actual abuse. Proponents of regulation and departing from free speech exceptionalism will say, plausibly, that this cements their case. To reject good regulations on the basis of fears is to succumb to paranoia, to make a slippery slope argument of the worst kind. I think this is a real challenge. But I think it's perhaps not a slippery slope argument. I think it's worth bringing data points into the discussion beyond Canada, where liberal democratic institutions have enjoyed remarkable stability. For that stability is easy to take for granted, and liberals of fear, owing to their fear, wish to take little for granted. In countries in transition, like India and South Africa, attempts to regulate hate speech and incitement to racial violence have not been successful in undermining abuse. These have been turned against people on the left who have been advocating greater integration. So they've been used by the powerful to pursue political gain and to repress those with whom they disagree. Also, a recent report by Glenn Greenwald shows that the story in countries like France and England is really not as encouraging as exceptionalist skeptics might have you believe. So I think the most egregious case is that in 2015, France saw the arrest of 12 activists. What was their crime? They were arrested and sentenced for wearing T-shirts that read, "Long live Palestine, boycott Israel." When challenged, the sentences held up because the T-shirts were alleged to be anti-Semitic. If there's any doubt that the US is at a risk for going the same way, look no further than the legislation on the table that would make it illegal for companies to boycott Israel. Or the fact that Republican legislators are already trying to get Black Lives Matter classified as a hate group. Is it mere paranoia to worry that they'll use the new proposed legislation to suppress the speech of such groups? Now, you might argue that this isn't a failure of regulations, this is a failure of democratic accountability. If we had better checks on governments, then we would be able to do away with a lot of these problems. Perhaps so, but it is important that what accountability to a demos secures depends upon the composition of the demos. All across the world, we're witnessing a resurgence of hate groups and far-right political activity. We ignore these trends at our peril. Already leaders of these groups, like the wonderful Gavin McGuinness, claim that they are motivated by the rise of hate speech legislation, which they see as unjust. Suppose they were to gain power. Then, with regulations in hand, they might retaliate by restricting much speech that ought to be protected. For example, think pieces and works of scholarship that explore the implications of whiteness, or statements issued by Antifa, also classified as a hate group. It goes without saying that were this retaliation undertaken, it would constitute an inappropriate suppression of ideas and the unjust jailing of persons. Plausibly, things wouldn't have to stop there. For resentful of restrictions on their own speech, they might vie for further restrictions on the speech of those who disagree. The point is that the post-war period, which has grown both American exceptionalism and these restrictions on speech abroad in places like Canada, Germany, and France, remains young, perhaps too young for critics of the liberalism of fear to declare victory. For the liberalism of fear recognizes that we live in a dynamic world, that victories won might be reversed in time, and that we ought to have in place the most general safeguards for our freedoms, that they may be wrested from us only with the greatest difficulty. Right. So, summing up, embrace the darker mill, reject calls to depart from free speech exceptionalism, but also be aware that this, to somebody who disagrees, can ring seriously hollow. For none of it addresses the obvious point that free speech exceptionalism imposes burdens on citizens and doesn't do so equally. The poor and women and racial minorities are forced to accept duties of toleration for much speech that demeans them and their place in society in exchange for the freedoms of the already well-off and bigoted. In saying nothing about this, the defender of free speech exceptionalism seems insensitive to serious inequities. The first thing to do is admit that there's a problem there. But the second is to note that in the history of legislative and judicial abuse, it is minorities, racial and otherwise, that suffer the brunt of this abuse. If things go well, a regime of regulation seems to maximize the position of those in vulnerable positions. Right? But the liberal of fear does not assume that things will always go well. And her fear that even fears that even in the event that they do not are most significantly fears for the already vulnerable. Thus, when it matters, the views argued for here does indeed have a tilt toward concerns for the least well-off, but it's one that looks long, not short. I wish to admit that free speech exceptionalism leaves persons vulnerable in our epistemic situation in a suboptimal place by allowing a cacophony of often vicious voices. But I think it's to display a serious poverty of imagination to assume that the only way of addressing these obvious problems with the status quo is through regulation. Recall Mill's claim that laissez-faire is to be the norm unless departure from it is required to realize some great good. Required. Well, this necessary condition isn't met. There are options aside from interference with liberty to solve these problems. Defenders of free speech exceptionalism have not always helped their case, often suggesting that the only improper response to bad speech is more speech. There's wisdom in this call for more speech, but there are also problems with touting this as the only solution to bad speech. Critics are right to worry that bad speech is not always met with more speech, that often it's met with simply silence, and that can be harmful to people. They're right to worry that the truth doesn't always win out when things are left unregulated. I think defenders of exceptionalism ought to do better, and I'm hoping to have a conversation with you guys in the Q&A about what we can do to do better in this regard. There's work to be done here, and we need to exercise more imagination in characterizing how this work is to be undertaken. So in closing, I think one answer is to look to Mill again. So Mill distinguishes between government and its authoritative and government and its non-authoritative roles. And its authoritative role, up here, government uses guns and commands people to do things and not to do things. Whereas skeptics of free speech exceptionalism and enthusiasts of free speech exceptionalism alike seem to focus entirely on the authoritative employment of government, which operates by issuing commands that restrict liberties, Government also has non-authoritative uses. In its non-authoritative capacity, governments can certify sources of information, issue statements against racial violence and in favor of full citizenship for all, and provide compensation for victims of racial hatred. We do well also to note how various different non-governmental entities might do similar things, to provide communities of support for those whose dignity is attacked and put on trial by hateful speech, to review sources of information and weed out epistemically vicious sources, and to provide educational and outreach services for tackling hate and bigotry at its very roots. So with these calls for richer imagination and deep curiosity to hear what yours produces in response to all this, I'll conclude. Thanks for the time. Yeah.
I guess the first question is you talk about the danger in the liberalism of fear and how there is a potential slippery slope there. But doesn't your argument in and of itself also contain a slippery slope, in that you assume that if one group gains the ability to regulate speech, that their opponents will at some point, down the road also gain the ability to regulate speech and will do so?
Yeah. So great. I think this is a real worry. So I think a lot of my opponents are going to, from a certain perspective, are going to say, you're making a slippery slope argument. You're saying that if we get these regulations on speech, these other consequences will follow, and you've really provided no reason to believe that they'll follow. Except that I think that's not quite right. So slippery slope arguments are a fallacy if you really do provide no reason to believe that these things will happen. But I think I've done something to show that this is actually exactly what happens. And I think if you look, if you spend time reading what people on the far right are saying about the current regulatory regime, it looks really plausible that what they really want to do is gain power to reverse things, to uphold white identities and suppress the contamination of Eurocentric politics. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that there's an empirical claim that I'm making. With empirical claims, you've got to pick the ones that are most plausible. I think a long view of political history vindicates the ones that I'm inclined to make, but that's a long conversation. Anna.
So you mentioned that Mill, sort of running through a lot of steps, argues that restriction speech is only sort of okay when it's completely necessary and there's no other ways to fix whatever issue you're talking about. So I was curious if Mill mentions any specifics in terms of what some exceptions might be, because I was trying to think of something I couldn't come up with.
So the exception that he talks about explicitly in the domain of expression is incitement. So the stuff that Holmes is also citing. So the example he gives is that there's like a corn shortage, and there's a mob outside the house of a corn producer. And he imagines somebody getting up at a podium, I think, and saying, look, this guy's responsible for the shortage in corn. And they've got their pitchforks and their flaming torches, and then they go commit violence. He thinks that that would be a sort of unprotected speech. It would be necessary to maintain the integrity of property and personal bodily integrity to restrict that kind of speech. Yeah. But he doesn't, he talks about lots of other reasons that government interference in other spheres is necessary. That stuff's in the later parts of On Liberty and in the Principles of Political Economy. But he's relatively, and this is something that he's criticized for, he's relatively clear that basically the only thing he thinks is a reasonable reason to restrict somebody's expression of an opinion is incitement. Okay.
And does he make the distinction between speech versus speech that leads to action the way that you did, or?
So yeah, he doesn't have a really clearly worked out distinction. Nobody does, actually. It's remarkably difficult to come up with a distinction between speech and action. Fred Schauer is a great scholar of free speech issues. He was at Wellesley for a panel on free speech recently, and he thinks it's just completely impossible and that this completely undermines any attempt to protect speech, because really there's just a continuum of speech and action, and the reasons for regulating action apply to speech as well, and there's no hard and fast distinction. But yeah.
I guess my question is like how would you apply these arguments to a restriction on free speech that doesn't actually come from the government? Because in my opinion, like a lot of the most egregious violations of free speech come from things like social media or universities or other things like that, which don't necessarily have the same kind of power that a government does. So how does that apply?
So just for the sake of enriching the discussion, could you talk a little bit about the free speech issues that are caused by social media companies? Huh?
Alex Jones is like a perfect example. Alex Jones got removed from YouTube, Twitter, Facebook. Those are the only ones that come to mind. But yeah.
Wasn't there also currently a lawsuit against him? Or that was just like one actually? I think there was.
There was?
Yeah.
Okay.
So the general idea is that you've got these social media companies which provided a platform for people to exercise expression, and they have policies that they've used to suspend accounts that violate their terms of use, and there are sort of political there's a political tilt to some of those policies, and so people are claiming that their liberties are really violated by these companies. So, I mean, I think that there is a bias in the liberalism of fear toward concern with governments. And so I actually was sitting up a couple nights ago while I was working on this paper, and I was thinking, like, does the liberalism of fear, this is actually what I wrote just to indicate how great a question this is, does the liberalism of fear indicate that social media companies ought to be prohibited from banning users for political reasons? I think it's a really, really difficult question, right? I mean, one reason to think not is that as much power as Facebook and Twitter have, there are exit options. So you can go to a different social media thing and use your thing. Now, what if you are denied a platform entirely? Well, I don't know. Do you have a right to a platform provided at someone else's expense? I don't know. Those are some reasons to think no. Reasons to think yes. Well, these places are the public sphere in a lot of ways. Like, so much political discourse goes in this direction. And so I think the new frontier on a lot of this free speech stuff is engaging with philosophical questions surrounding these issues. I don't have a really clear and worked out answer. I just have thoughts. I don't know. What do you think? Are you really concerned about the social media companies and think that they're violating rights to speech?
I mean, I think I agree with a lot of what you said in favor of, making sure that people get a right to speech. I just think that, like, at this point, Twitter, Facebook, whatever, are so vital to discourse. And also, like, I mean, you definitely gave objections to the argument that, like, more speech is always better. But at the point at which, like, Alex Jones is literally just getting pushed into, like, deeper underground sites that, his followers know about because that's where they originally found him, but people who aren't necessarily, like, familiar with him, but people who are very adamantly opposed to him can't necessarily find him, then that restricts only the kind of speech that would, like, promote any kind of discourse.
Yeah.
Get, like, echo chambers, what people talk about, so.
But so, like, to play devil's advocate, I mean, Alex Jones can still write an op-ed for the Washington Post, or they won't publish it, right? But that's always been sort of the prerogative of publishers and publishing houses. You can get it in the public square, right? So, I mean, I don't know. I'm torn. I really am, because I see the worry, but at the same time, I sort of think, well, in some meaningful sense, his right to expression is protected so far as he can seek out venues for his views. It's an interesting question what obligations we have as private parties to provide others with space for that. It's a further interesting question what public-private entities like corporations have in the way of obligations in this respect. It's plausible to think that maybe they have more of an obligation than, say, me if I have to, say, open my living room up to public discourse. Like, I don't think I have to do that. But corporations are private public entities. They're sort of artificial bodies that are created by a complicated sphere of law. They get certain benefits from the state. Maybe they have a special obligation to do more. I think this is the new frontier. I think it needs smart people thinking about it.
But under the current definition of corporate personhood as established by the Supreme Court, couldn't you make the case that, you know, corporations as persons do not have the need to enable, I guess, speech? As you just said, you know, you don't have to open up your living room, so why should corporations have to open up their chat rooms or other things?
I don't know, yeah. What do other folks think of these kinds of issues? Because I'm curious to learn from you, in a way, about these kinds of things. Yeah, Anna.
For me, it gets a little bit more tricky when you consider, like, I mean, like, if you consider, like, Wellesley as an institution, it's clear that Wellesley gets some funding from the state, so even if it is, like, a private institution, it is in ways entangled with the government, which is clear, but then when you think about, like, say, corporations, I was like, well, no, they're private entities, they're, like, totally separate from the government, but, like, for example, I think Amazon gets, like, billion, or, like, millions, or even $1 billion in, like, tax subsidies, from the government for them to, like, move to certain places.
To New York recently, yeah.
And so, like, even private institutions that don't directly necessarily have, interests tied with the state, I think are still very much, maybe not all of them, but I think a lot of them are still very much, in some ways, like, connected to the state. So I think when it comes to, like universities, I think to me that is very clear in that since they get funding from the state, I think that they have more obligations than, say, a private corporation. But I think that you could even further extend it to private corporations. But that's okay.
All super interesting. So let's have you. Remind me your name. Casey. Yeah.
I would just say, I don't know. Don't you think that there's a distinction between the, I guess, regulation of government and then the like economic involvement of the government? Because with the example of Amazon that you just used, the tax subsidies that are provided by New York were created in a competitive bidding process, whereby the government was kind of acting in some ways as a corporation and was acting kind of as a part of a marketplace almost, right? Because there was competition for Amazon's jobs and the revenue that the tax revenue that those jobs are going to bring in. So New York providing subsidies was just it trying to compete with other places. And I don't know that I necessarily see how that is directly correlated with the government's actions insofar as it regulates speech. I feel like those are kind of two separate functions of the government that shouldn't be necessarily combined in our minds.
Oh. Or do you want to respond, or? I'm open.
Okay, sure. I mean, I do agree with some of what you're saying. I think I'm at a place where I haven't thought about it enough to sort of formulate a strong opinion, and I think that on a philosophical level, it is difficult to say whether those two things are connected enough to make a difference in the obligation. And I'm not saying that private corporations should have the same obligation as governments or states in terms of free speech. I guess I'm just sort of throwing out there that maybe they have a little bit more obligation than they currently upheld at the moment. But it's not really something that I've thought very much about. And I think that on a philosophical level, there really isn't an answer, just because all of this is very new, and I'm sure that there are tons of people that do read things out there.
So 1, 2. Yeah.
Okay, so I just wanted to return to because what you said about how corporations are people in certain circumstances. That's very interesting, and also just in relation to a lot of what people have said about monetary interests in these kinds of things. Corporations are classified as people when they correct me if I'm wrong, give money to certain things, and then their viewpoints are considered as being restricted. That's the condition under which that
yeah, I'm just personally, the case I'm personally familiar with, Citizens United.
Yeah,
But I think that there's also one or two other cases previously that basically they're equating money with speech and using the First Amendment to define it as such.
Right, but like in the case of Twitter and Facebook and anything, there's no monetary interest when Alex Jones makes a Twitter account. So like in terms of, having a monetary interest in these kinds of things, when money is no object in these kinds of circumstances, it's like, how do the obligations change? Like it's very easy to like frame it as like money in exchange for a service or money to promote a certain opinion that you're in favor of. But, like,
what about ad revenue?
I mean,
yeah, sometimes ad revenue. It's the same thing as YouTube's ad populace. Like you can't have the same. You're now restricted on what you can say in your YouTube videos in order to get any money from AdSense, which is.
Can you also like opt out of that?
You can opt out of that and go with sponsors, but you're missing out on a lot of revenue as far as YouTube goes.
But aren't you then like not making money directly from YouTube, but making money like through YouTube? But I'm not sure exactly how this
But still,
works.
maybe YouTube as a corporation doesn't want. I mean, they have a right, I think, to not let certain people use. They're corporations. They're not the U.S. government, so I don't think they're susceptible to laws unless we pass another law regulating whether or not they should allow everyone to use the platforms or not. But I mean, in the meantime, they don't have obligation, and to obligate them to allow someone like Alex Jones would, in a way, be restricting the corporation's freedom to discern what is harmful or not to the business.
Well, so I think, that's a really good point. I think there are two questions, and it's easy to mix these together, right? One question is that should these sorts of companies have a legal obligation to allow their platforms to basically be free speech zones? Right? A second question is, supposing that they don't have such an obligation, supposing that they're free to do whatever they want, is there a wrong way for them to exercise that freedom? Do they have some other kind of, say, a moral obligation or a social obligation to do this stuff? I think the second question is actually more interesting, primarily because I think there's good reason for thinking that these sorts of organizations are sort of, right now, they're, if you have a rosy view of their motives, and maybe it's mostly about securing ad revenue, but if you believe some of the statements that they make on these kinds of issues, this is private parties attempting to make the world of discourse a little bit better. And I think there's good reason to allow people who are using their own resources basically to do that. There's a separate question as to whether they're actually making it better or whether they're making it worse. And I think that's a whole set of interesting ethical issues that nobody's really thought through very clearly.
In response to that, my main thoughts are, why should they have a moral obligation? And to that end, why do we have any distinct moral obligations? I mean, sure, we're limited in respect to what liberties we have and are recognized by this government, but as you were saying before, with going based off of feelings rather than reasons, is that necessarily right to go about life, and is it necessarily right to impose that upon a corporate personhood, too? The idea that anything must be done based upon feelings rather than reasons, and is that necessarily how things should be done?
So I think me and Mill agree that it's not a good feature of human beings that they just appeal to feelings and not reasons. I think there's a very rich domain of reasons that pull us in various directions, such that we act irrationally or badly when we're not sensitive to those kinds of reasons, that aren't like imposed from anywhere else. They just have, I have weird views about metaethics. They're just kind of out there. They're the reasons that there are. But I think the question you ask, like, why think that the reasons pull in this direction? Why think that there are like non-legal reasons for corporations to provide this kind of platform? Really important philosophical question.
And do we necessarily want to even think about moral or ethical reasons if they're just based off of feelings? I mean, does that mean that they really matter if it's based off of emotions? Because that's not a way that you can go about life.
So I think, what me and Mill are both going to want to say is, yes, of course you want to worry about reasons. You just want to worry about them in a way that's sensitive to the fact that most people won't actually do it. But I want to go back to your first question in a second, but I don't want to talk anymore.
Sure. So I just think like two things. First, I believe that in this particular instance where we're talking about corporations, especially like social media platforms, that in addition to the moral, obligation that we've been talking about, there's also a fiduciary obligation to the shareholders. As you've already said, they're a private public corporation. And insofar as there are individual citizens who have a financial stake in the company has a duty to those shareholders to try to maximize ad revenue. And if they can do so by regulating speech and by trying to make their platform as sanitary as possible, then that's a fact-based argument that you can use in terms of obligations. And then secondly, I guess I just want to push back against the idea that moral obligations are somehow not logical. And I know that sounds silly because morality and logic don't necessarily always go hand in hand, but I think that completely discounting morals and feelings from the argument is dangerous, because humans are not purely rational creatures, and that absolutely, as you already said, is a very integral part of how we make decisions. So while at the end of the day, I think that facts and logic should have a bigger say, I think it's very pernicious to try to make an argument based purely on facts while ignoring the reality, which oftentimes does include morals and feelings of people.
So yeah, I mean, I think this is a good, your case of the fiduciary duties is an interesting one, because it puts in sharp relief your first question, which I wanted to come back to anyway. So suppose that there are fiduciary reasons for them to clean up their platforms such that they'll generate more ad revenue without racist Bob spewing his crap all over the place, which is plausible and speaks well, I think, of the public sphere in certain respects, that it would be the case that that companies would get punished for being vicious, or for giving a platform to vicious bigots. So why would a company, so fiduciary duties are one class of duties. You have a legal obligation to care about your shareholders and the stakeholders in your company too. But sometimes you can maximize on fiduciary lines only by violating moral obligations. So in a case, like, you can maximize your revenue, suppose, by enslaving your workforce and paying them no wages and not letting them. Now, this might actually not be true. There might be good reasons that that workforce would be very unproductive. Suppose it were true, right? That's how you maximize your revenue, and that's how you best satisfy your fiduciary duties. It's pretty plausible to think you shouldn't do that, right? All things considered, you should not enslave your workforce. So given that there are perhaps financial reasons for companies to clean up their platforms, it's still possible, I think, that they shouldn't do it. And so thinking through, so you ask, why shouldn't they do it? I think that's a good question. So why might they not should do that? Right? Why might it be the case that they really shouldn't clean up their platforms, even if it's in their financial interest? Okay.
Well, do you mean from a moral standpoint?
Yeah, from a moral standpoint.
Well,
yeah.
In many ways, removing Alex Jones is just the best example of racist Bob. But anyway, removing racist Bob, you make racist Bob's followers even angrier, and thus it incites more of this self-victimization from the far right, in which they feel more ostracized and thus are, I'm kind of repeating myself.
Yeah, good. Yeah, I think that's a great point. Did you have something similar?
I think that just like an underlying problem in this whole argument is just like we need to have a clear sense of what the moral obligations of like a corporation like YouTube are before we weigh like the extent to which they should actually be followed through and how much they should be weighed against like fiduciary obligations. Because I mean, I think corporations have both, right? If every corporation's only goal is to like maximize revenue, then there would literally be no diversity of corporations ever. I think, or at least a lot less than there are now. Like, I think that there's a balance. And then in terms of like a moral obligation to actually, or not promote, but allow people like Alex Jones to speak, I mean, I think it just goes back to what you were saying about tyranny, right? It's like, it's just a different form of tyranny. It's tyranny from like a different place. Just because it doesn't come from the government doesn't mean that there aren't like really powerful people out there who are restricting your rights. Like, I can restrict someone else's rights by, I don't know, like if I punch someone in the face hypothetically, like that's me violating their like right to bodily autonomy, and then the government steps in and says, "No, you can't do that. Don't punch people." But like if a corporation restricts your right to speech, like why? I just think it's tyranny from a different perspective. And if the government's obligation in a vacuum is to prevent tyranny, it should just prevent tyranny from itself.
Yeah. I mean, so there are these other cases. I read in my class on toleration, I read a paper about sort of making a consequentialist argument for tolerating hate speech, where it's like given a platform and it's sort of widely known about. Senator, do you remember the basic argument? No, I'm not going to put you on the spot. So anyway, so basically the idea of this author whose name I'm blanking on right now is, look, when you give these people a platform, you let other people know who they are. And when other people know who they are, they can be kept out of public office. Which I think is actually not a crazy argument. So there have been a number of cases recently where this has like actually happened, where somebody says something stupid about white supremacy, why is that such a bad word these days, and suddenly gets suspended from all his committee duties, and everybody's aware that this guy should be out of office. Like, those are good things. Like, you want to know to some degree who your neighbors are. We live in an increasingly anonymous society, and so there's one reason to think, yeah, like, maybe part of social media companies' obligation to allow folks to speak is just so that we can all get to know them, who they are, what they'll do if they gain power. Like, that seems like a pretty plausible moral reason to think, okay, well, even if YouTube, say, can maximize financial revenue by deplatforming someone, maybe we want not their deplatforming. Maybe we should put pressure on YouTube to see that there are other things. In the exact other direction, I think there are reasons to think that sometimes precisely what you want is for private parties to use their own resources to make the world better. And insofar as the world is better without that noise, maybe they're doing what they should be doing. That's why I think that this is one of the most difficult and interesting questions surrounding free speech. But, I mean, that it's interesting and important doesn't mean that it's senseless to focus on the state type issues, because I really do think there are reasons to fear that this goes very badly too. Other questions, comments?
If everyone is okay, I'd like to change the trajectory of the discussion a little bit.
I like that.
Okay. So how does the, I guess, the free speech exceptionalism that you were discussing in your presentation, how does that relate to, I guess, like consumer protection? So, especially in regards to like false claims and falsehoods.
Yeah.
You know, if a product wants to claim that it cures cancer, what's the boundary in terms of free speech?
Yeah.
The FDA, actually. A friend of mine's, sorry to interrupt, but a friend of mine's grandfather has this supplement that's proven to do some things that, depending on what it is, could help prevent cancer. However, in the product that my friend wants to make, he's not allowed to say this product prevents cancer. You have to say the ingredient within it, which is FDA approved, could help prevent cancer. And you're due to FDA and regulation on food and products themselves that the government has. You're not allowed to say that.
Yeah, I'm familiar with the FDA regulations, and just asking like whether or not those would stand under this, like whether or not the FDA has the right, I guess, under free speech exceptionalism to regulate things like that.
So a normative argument, which is, yeah, I like these. Yeah, I mean, so you're fired is speech in one sense and action in another sense. It's really action. It's governed by employment law, and rightfully so. Advertisement is tricky. So I'm worried about some of the restrictions on how you can advertise products, in part because sometimes they're so restrictive that people end up not getting products that they need that would actually help them. But in general, I think that defrauding people is not permissible, and that's the action that you're doing by peddling speech like that. And you're not, like, it's not expressing an opinion, right? It's saying, this product does this, give me money for it. So, I mean, just to give you an example, you buy a car, right? And somebody says, a car has no problems. Well, in Massachusetts, there's a lemon law. So you buy a used car, someone says it has no problems, the transmission falls out of it the next day. You can litigate with that person. I think that seems right to me, that you should be able to litigate. There are informational asymmetries between actors. On the other hand, so I do think I'm pro these sorts of structures that allow torts to be raised against folks who defraud us. But I do worry about the ways in which this can lead us to be complacent. So I'll give you a rather embarrassing example of this. So I grew up here. Consumer protection law is pretty good. You go around, you Google, say, a locksmith, and you can be pretty sure that you're going to get a legitimate locksmith if it's got decent reviews. I lived in Germany for a year last year, and I locked myself out of my apartment, and I didn't have all that much data on my data plan, so I kind of Googled a locksmith, and it had reviews, and it seemed good, and I had the person come, and I was thinking, yeah, there's not going to be any problem with this at all. And the guy charged me like $800 to get in, and there was like nothing I could do about it. And so there's a way in which I've been made soft by our decent regulatory environment. There's a way in which it would be better for me if I was led to be less trusting of some places, because not all places have good protections. So yeah, I don't know, mixed bag, but mostly I'm in favor of being able to sue people who defraud you, and to think that that's not expressing an opinion. And there, why don't we start with you?
I mean, I think that there's like a larger question there, which is like, what's the line between a statement of false fact and like the statement of an opinion? I think like a really good example of this would be like climate change denial, because a lot of people who believe that climate change is a thing and probably we should do something about it will be like, hey, look at all of these facts that say climate change is a thing, and then people who deny climate change will say, well, that's your opinion, and then they'll say, no, that's a fact, and they'll say, no, that's an opinion. Yeah. So it's like, if you're saying that climate change doesn't exist, is that a fact or an opinion? And if it's a statement of false fact, like, should you be able to sue someone for that?
Yeah, I mean, so it seems like it's got to be the expression of an opinion, but it's an opinion about a fact. It seems to me like, you know, if you genuinely disagree with the research for some reason, or even if you're maliciously peddling lies, that we're better served allowing you to do it and proceeding with good science than restricting your freedom for reasons that I sort of touched on in the talk. Like, I really do worry that we have a crisis in the public reputation of science, which is not aided by the relationship that scientists have with the government right now, and that would be worse if then scientists were given some say in saying, okay, well, you should restrict these kinds of things. I think that's bad for the credibility of science in the long term. I also think that, you know, if somebody's a creationist or something and gains power, if they've got a precedent for getting rid of bunk science, it doesn't really matter if they're wrong, because power is the rule in politics, not right, unfortunately. So, yeah, I mean, another thing that's worth noting, it's a little bit of optimism amid all the darkness, is that public opinion is starting to recover and approach conformity with scientific opinion on the existence of climate change. It's been a slow change, and if you look at some of the charts that I think it's Pew puts out on public sentiment on these issues, what really you can see that it just plummets right around ClimateGate, which is, there was an email chain between IPCC scientists that suggested to some people that scientists were trying to fudge the data to produce the result that global warming was happening. And right around this time, public opinion, where it was roughly tracking, there was a little bit of lag, but it was roughly tracking scientific opinion, it just starts to be skeptical. And then there were investigations and the scientists were exonerated and it was very good, but public opinion has been just slow to recover. So there's reason to think that maybe on the climate change denialism stuff, laissez-faire is a little bit better than I've painted it out to be. But I do worry that when you start having the state pronounce on matters of fact, there's a recipe for disaster there. What you want, I think, is the state or certifying agencies trying to help citizens discharge their epistemic duties. So my mother, bless her heart, is a wonderful human being who really wants to be on the cutting edge of things, but she reads the worst crap. But it's not her fault. It really isn't her fault because there's just everything out there all the time. And so she reads this stuff and she forms these very strong opinions, and I'm like, well, you gotta, she doesn't have access. People don't have access to peer-reviewed articles outside of a university. They don't have the tools often to understand them. But you can get scientific literacy up. You can get people looking at better journalistic reports of scientific findings that are less misleading. And I think those are all things that we should be doing, but nobody seems to want to talk about it. It's always like, this is really bad, look how bad this is, let's regulate. It's like, no, let's be creative, let's be interesting people and figure out better ways to go about this without inviting oppression and tyranny.
To that end, isn't the government as well as private organizations already doing things like that? I know that on Facebook and other places they have verified news sources, and there's been this whole media frenzy about fake news, and the government is actively trying to do things like that. So isn't the solution that you're suggesting already?
It's emerging, yeah. It's emerging. It's not something that philosophers seem to talk much about, and there have been challenges, right? Because there's a certain subset of the population that's allergic to authority, and so when something is shown to be verified, they're going to be like, oh, well, that's just them. That's special interest trying to convince me what to believe. I'm going to believe the opposite thing. So I think that there are real challenges still in figuring out how to do this well in a way that doesn't just get a significant subset of the population, to believe exactly the opposite of what you want to believe. But I think that would be a more productive discussion to have than a discussion over regulation. But as a great MIT philosophy professor once said in a talk, I have very little faith that the state is the solution on a lot of these things too. So, yeah.
I may have missed it, but what was your argument addressing the third contention against FSC? Essentially that the neutral protection of speech propagates inequality.
To grant the second premise, it probably will. Although, I mean, think about the civil rights movement, the abolition of slavery movement. These were at first minority movements that eventually triumphed in one. I mean, this is one reading of history. I think it's probably the right reading, but there are people who disagree. Eventually won out, and it supported the rights of minorities. So I think it's MLK Day around this. The arc of the universe is long bends toward justice. That seems roughly actually right. I do think that it's not going to be perfectly egalitarian in its results, and I think we just have to be creative about how. So there's a formula, right? Neutral protection of rights plus existing inequalities equals further inequalities. Right? There are two inputs to get the further inequalities. The one is the existing inequalities. and the other is the neutral enforcement of rights. I think a lot of people go after the neutral enforcement of rights as a way of getting rid of the resulting further inequalities. The other thing you can do is just try to fix some of the problems of inequality of voice. So how do you get people a bigger platform who are worse off and have fewer resources? I think that's a question that people aren't really thinking too hard about.
Could you make the argument that kind of that third contention and the kind of laissez-faire attitude towards that third contention is one of the reasons that we're now seeing a rise in political correctness, that people are, in lieu of government regulation, kind of self-regulating and self-enforcing certain norms?
Yeah, I worry about that. I think that's right. And I think that political correctness comes from a really good place. And we're working out, social norms are slow to change and they have to be worked out and they're buggy. It's like when the new iPhone comes out and you want to wait until they can work out the bugs to buy it. A lot of these norms, you want to wait until we work out the bugs, but some sort of policing, depending on your goals of discourse, seems like that's what you should do, right? Like if you're in a bus and somebody says to a black person, get to the back of the bus, you should stand up and say something. Of course you should do that. So there's some sense in which political correctness, of course, safe spaces, of course you should have, you know? But the question is, how do you have these things without making it the case that people are more likely to pursue formal ways of getting what they want in these domains?
So to clarify, you're in favor of kind of informal regulation as long as it's not...
I mean, which isn't to say I don't worry about it, but I think that, yeah, boycotting things and exercising voice in these ways, these are the stuff of actual political change, and I think the legal change often just follows from it. And so you've got to be careful with the informal stuff, and you want to make sure that your means, the means that you're taking, are conducive to the goals. So some folks who are political correctness enthusiasts are militant, and they alienate people who are uneducated and who just don't know why what they said was wrong. The way to bring that person over or to get them to stop isn't to shame them and call them dumb and stupid and uneducated. The way is to talk to them and figure out where they're coming from and be civil and a human being. But that we should just like, so I don't mean laissez-faire in the interpersonal sense, right? Like this is maybe like an artifact of a bunch of the religious stuff that came out, but I think we have a duty to help our fellow citizens become better human beings. That's a task that we all have, and that it's not easy to do, and sometimes we need help. But I think there's a way to go about it which is terrible and alienating and counterproductive, and a way to go about it that's human and big and right. Yeah.
Okay. So you mentioned it was sort of this second. Oh wait, no. The second, Mill argument against speech about silencing. So you kind of touched on this again at the end when you said that in a lot of cases, like, people are delegitimizing silence and then don't have the ability to respond or don't have the legitimacy to respond, at which point there isn't actually free speech or equal speech.
There's not an equal ability to communicate.
Okay, there's not an equal ability to communicate. But if there's not an equal ability to communicate just from like a moral perspective, like how can you endorse free speech if there is no possibility for discourse?
So, because I understand free speech to be constituted by the absence of formal regulation. Now, I'm also very, very concerned about effective communication. But I think that your speech can be free in the relevant sense even if you can't communicate effectively. And what you have then is a problem, right? You have a social problem. And I think that something that I'd like to do in future work is to try to figure out how best to actually respond to that problem. I said future work. No, I don't know. I mean, I do think that, so, you know, I mentioned being of two minds about social media companies note platforming people. That's one way of getting folks who are typically silenced in a laissez-faire public sphere more voice. That's the one side of that where I think, like, yeah, maybe that's not a bad way to go. And as they have more voice in those contexts, then they can develop skills to deal with other contexts. You know, that's one thing that I think about. I think about, so Jacob Levy, who's a political theory professor in Montreal, he argues that there's really good reason for thinking that safe spaces are actually important for this sort of reason, right? You want to give folks who typically don't have voice a place where they might be comfortable. Now, you want to do that in a way without leading the whole public sphere to be a safe space, which I think is a concern. But the idea that there would be places where folks who are typically silenced by discourse to speak freer, communicate more freely would be not a bad way to go. I think there are really complicated questions around the implementation of those things and who has the obligation to provide them, or whether this is something that's a philanthropic duty that various folks have. I think interpersonally, we just have to get better at learning to talk to one another. I think lots of folks are silenced in lots of different contexts, and they're not always the same people. So the silencing literature and philosophy focuses a lot on people of color and women. I think that's like a really important group of people who are silenced in a lot of discourse by various things, plausibly. I think that there are other groups of people in other contexts, so people with very unorthodox opinions on campuses like Wellesley, like, probably feel like they have less ability to communicate freely. One response to this is to try to get people to be courageous, because ultimately that's what we've always needed, is people to be courageous. But another thing is to think about the norms that we're perpetuating, to think about the various ways in which public opinion is stated in ways that imply that people who demur are crazy or irrational. This is something Mill worries about a lot in non-liberty. Like, the tyranny of the majority is a tyranny not just for the formal laws, but also for the morality of public opinion. I think there are a lot of things to think about in this regard, but they're not sort of legal free speech things. Yeah.
I guess just as a follow-up, like, when we talk about safe spaces, like, I agree, like, safe spaces in many cases can be good, but the whole point of a safe space is the ability to talk, or not the whole point, but one of the many facets of a safe space is the ability to talk without necessarily being questioned and disagreed with. It's like a place to, you know, be secure in one's identity without having to defend it constantly.
Yeah.
But if, like, if free speech is important insofar as people have the right in and of themselves to express in like a particular context, like, doesn't that take away the importance of, like, disagreement? Like,
well, you might think that disagreement has its place, right? Like, when I'm in my house, like, I think disagreement is a great thing. I think it would be great if we had more productive disagreement in colleges and universities than we do. I think there are a lot of students who come to colleges and universities and never end up challenged. I think that's a shame. But it has a place. Like, there's no obligation if you're a liberal to watch Fox and Friends every day. There's no obligation to cultivate friendships with only people that you politically dislike. There's no obligation to seek out every piece of news that disagrees with your point of view. There's some obligation to seek out some of that stuff some of the time. But I mean, I think that to have a place where you can build up your reserves and a place where you're constantly challenged for things can be refreshing, right? If you have sort of minority political views and you're constantly getting sort of attacked for those views, and then you find a group of like-minded others, the feeling that you feel is probably being refreshed. Now, if you're like me, eventually it starts to get like, oh God, I got to get out of here. It's an echo chamber. It's boring. I'm not growing and learning. So you got to go back out. You can't always be in the safe space. But there's something cathartic about just being able to like share a common experience and build up resolve in those ways. Yeah.
I also feel like, well, in defense of safe spaces, I feel like rather than disagreement, it's more in avoidance of disrespect. Because I'm also someone who really enjoys disagreeing, but to a certain extent with disagreement, there frequently is disrespect. And I think it's a necessity for the mental health of minorities frequently in order to find a place, in order to convene and discuss things without fear of that disrespect. And I mean, why you could even extend the definition of a safe space to include all organizations of similar interest. Like even Wellesley College Republicans, which I'm not a part of, but like they convene and discuss their similar opinions, and it's good for them because they have a minority voice on this campus, and they probably need to build up their resolve amongst each other in order to go out and disagree more. So I feel like it's a necessity for minorities, but that's just my own opinion. And if you are a member of Wellesley College Republicans, you can disagree with me.
Well, when we get together, for the most part, we just disagree with each other.
Yeah, because we're weird.
Well, I haven't been, so I can't really speak.
But do you think it's disagreement? So I think one of the important aspects of the response was it's disagreement with, it can be disagreement, but you know you're not going to get disrespected or called like someone who panders to the rich and isn't interested in justice. You know that certain criticisms are off the table. Now you might disagree about a lot of stuff, but having those things off the table some of the time, that's probably good for you, right?
It's productive disagreement, and we're disagreeing in a manner that we're trying to convince each other while listening to each other's arguments, as opposed to just blindly repeating the same.
So it is free of disrespect, which is essentially, if you do define safe space in the way that I do, which you may not, that is kind of falling under the. It's like with ballroom, for example, which I'm on the ballroom dance team. When we get together, we talk about how much we love to dance, and there's no one there that's like, dancing is terrible. We don't have to argue about that.
Like when I meet for coffee with philosophy colleagues, I know that I'm not going to get certain political theory objections or economics objections to the things that I'm working on. Now, I think those objections are often super important to deal with, but I also think I couldn't be productive as a philosopher if I was always concerned about them. If I had to if I couldn't test out an argument without worrying about those kinds of concerns. Like so when I was in Germany, I sat in on a political theory seminar, and I learned a tremendous amount, right? But if I had to always be in that environment when I was discussing my work,
on the defensive,
I'd be on the defensive, and I wouldn't be able to do anything positive. So I mean, I think that there are two ways of looking at civil society, right? One is that we're all unified by, and this is to paint with a very broad brush, we're all unified by a state, and we've got to share the same interests, and we've got to get all the spheres to look like they're governed by roughly the same rules. Right? The second is to think that civil society is a patchwork of different institutions, right? Philanthropic institutions, for-profit institutions, educational institutions, clubs, sports teams, universities, whatever. And they're all governed by different norms, and that's okay because human life is complicated and we have lots of different needs. What we need to be able to do is make sure that we can leave those places and go talk about people who are doing other things in parts of other institutions. You don't necessarily need everything to be governed by the same set of norms. Now, this is a view called, so Jacob Levy, I'm a fan if you can't tell, calls this pluralism. And he thinks that the history of political thought is just a disagreement between pluralists and people who are rationalists and want unity everywhere. Now I'm a rationalist in one sense, but that's different. So, yeah.
I guess to just return to the original question a little bit, I feel like the problem arises when people don't venture outside safe spaces, because originally what you were talking about in your speech was was about when people who otherwise would have these safe spaces where they can like disagree in these like smaller communities where there's like already a baseline of agreement or of respect, when they don't venture outside of those and when they don't disagree in the public sphere, like what's the problem with that? Like you could talk about WCR, right?
Rather than not venturing out of the safe space, I'd say it's trying to make everywhere a safe space.
That's the rationalist urge taking over, right?
Sure, but like, for example, in the WCR, like a lot of people in the WCR, some more than others, I think, venture out and like actively engage in like the political sphere of Wellesley College. But on the other hand, like, it's pretty rare that someone who's like not in some way conservative identified or conservative leaning ventures into the WCR to like make their voice heard and dissent in that other like smaller sphere.
Because I don't think that's the purpose of WCR. Like, for example,
like WCR would very much welcome that.
I've been invited
we had that
several
person who
times,
studied
but
us
I
for a
didn't
while.
go
There was someone studying you guys? That's sweet. Oh, that's cool.
She was studying us for a paper.
Yeah, it was, I think, a sociology student from last year, and she came to a lot of our meetings just to listen to us, and then she wrote a paper about us.
She'd also share some ideas, but
Yeah.
we were studied.
Well, no, I mean, I do think that there's a problem both, you know, there are folks who might be on the cusp who would benefit from coming in, and then there are people who are in and they don't like to come out. And I think that is an issue, right? I think that you need some conception of civic virtue that helps you to navigate the public sphere and encourages you to go out in it and exchange ideas and disagree. Because there is a risk that these silos become isolating, right? I do have colleagues in philosophy who have become addicted to the safe space of the philosophy seminar room, who are uninterested in interdisciplinary exchange and whose work suffers for it, right? So that's a problem. What's the solution? I don't know, courage, civic virtue, making clear that this isn't to be, these norms aren't to be the norms that govern every institution, I guess. I'm not sure. Yeah.
You just said something that was interesting to me because it reminded me of something that you said earlier. And I think
Oh, is it interesting because it reminded you of something I said? That's like the greatest compliment that I've ever been paid.
It's kind of a compliment that hasn't really been brought up, I guess. But you just said, I think the issue arises when you try to make everywhere a safe space, which I'm not really sure that I have an opinion on that yet. But
It depends on the definition of safe space
Yeah,
that we're
yeah,
going, because
that's true.
we're working on two very different definitions.
That's
because
true.
I think I'm still working on the definition of no disagreements rather than things being off the table.
Well, working with the definition of no disrespect, what you said earlier, you said something like, I think it's our duty to improve everyone else, or something like.
Well, maybe not everyone, but some people some of the time, yeah, help out.
Something like kind of the goal.
A goal.
In your opinion, a goal is that we should all try to make the world a better place.
Yeah, like in my rosy eye as an idealist, I believe
So
this,
I think that, in some ways, is an underlying cause for this push to make everywhere a safe space, because intrinsically we want people to agree with us.
Yeah.
But also, I think there's a moral obligation that we feel we have in order to perpetuate a culture of respect, even in places where there wouldn't otherwise be. I don't know if that makes any sense.
No, I mean I think that's right.
I think that's where
I think a lot. No, a lot of the drive for unity comes from a very good place, right? You think, oh, these norms are good, they're working. In fact, they ensure that nobody's being disrespected. And then, you know, what it is to disrespect grows, and then suddenly you've got a place where spaces of disrespect become places of truncated or no disagreement, and that's no good. So I think it all comes from a good place. I think that the best antidote to stuff like that is to do really good means-end reasoning. So I don't really think that a lot of people have thought through whether the means that they take to create a better world are conducive to the end of actually creating a better world. I have friends that I fight with on the internet because I don't know how to use my time well. And I often say, like, I think this is a really good thing that you're trying to do, but I just think you haven't thought at all about whether you're likely to do the thing this way. And they're like, huh, yeah, but isn't it worth trying? And my reaction is, no. Lots of things aren't worth trying.
But is it worth trying to argue with them?
No, which is why I said I was a bad, no, maybe. I think ultimately it is. I'm actually an optimist about people's ability to change their mind. In the face of all my pessimism, I think if I weren't optimistic about that, I'd have chosen a weird, self-effacing career. But no, I really do think that you say, well, look, like some things aren't worth trying, because if you really do think about how human beings are going to react to, say, this universal set of safe space norms, you can't have read much history to think that it's going to go well. And to say it's worth a try because we've got these problems, I think is just to think that having the good intentions is what matters instead of having a concern about what works. I think like it's good to have lots of different spheres, lots of different norms for lots of different things. I think the norm governing my family, if I were to have kids, this is something that Jason Brennan says sometimes, that set of norms should be communism. Like, it should be. It would be corrupt to have the exchange of goods and services and private ownership of the means of production in my family. That says a little about. No, this is relevant because the philosophers like to imagine that they're on camping trips and stuff, and to imagine institutional ideals accordingly. Lots of norms for lots of different things. They don't all have to be the same. We get comfortable with messiness. We should understand that it's going to take a lot of work and reflection and to get people to come out of the places where they're comfortable and to engage. We should also recognize that we shouldn't expect them to be always out there and engaging. That's just an unreasonable expectation. You need to recover, slow down sometimes. So I mean, one of the things that that I'd actually be curious about, because I just didn't really discuss any of the, I sort of granted the second premises of all of these arguments. I think it's an open question. So I think it really, in a lot of these cases, especially when you talk about epistemic value and democratic deliberation, it's relative to the alternatives that we can imagine actually being implemented. So are there any optimists about exceptionalism and epistemic value? Like comment section and newspaper articles aside, are there folks that think actually that this is the best we can reasonably think of doing? I mean, this is often the response of people who like exceptionalism. It's to double down on a lot of the Millian arguments that this stuff is actually good, right? So you talk about reasons that corporations might have duties to allow a wide open public sphere. One of them is just the Millian consideration that conflict with error is a good way of producing truth. There's bystander effects. So when you see two people disagreeing, even if neither of them change their mind and they're just kind of yelling at each other, bystanders change their mind. They're like, oh, that view seems to be very ineptly defended here, and so maybe I go with the view that's better defended. And there are reasons to think that actually laissez-faire is good in terms of these kinds of values. And then there are courtrooms and college classrooms where these norms don't really slide. What do you think of premise 2? You don't like it?
No.
So you put the thumbs down there too. Why not?
Wait, okay, so I'm kind of confused, I guess. Premise 2 is just backing up premise 1, right?
It's basically, it's modus tollensing premise 1. So premise 1 is a conditional statement. Conditionals have two parts. They have antecedents and they have consequence. And there are logical rules that operate on them. And this is to say, this is a consequent, and it's denying the consequent to deny the antecedent, and it's a valid operation. But yeah, it's just an empirical claim that free speech exceptionalism doesn't promote these things, which you need to unlock the conclusion from the conditional. It's just a claim, right? It could be true or false.
I would, I think, largely agree with the second, I guess, contention or second claim, because I think that obviously there's nuance, right, and there are exceptions to every case, but I think by and large the vast majority of opinions that are currently like censored or currently regulated, including birther theories and climate change deniers. I think that those types of arguments don't necessarily carry the same epistemic value as others. So I would agree that I think that removing those from the public discourse doesn't necessarily prevent us from having a dialogue. It just removes certain facets of the dialogue that don't further the discussion. And obviously, like, there are exceptions to that, but I think that idea is not completely inaccurate.
Yeah, I gotta say I've learned, so one of the Millian arguments in favor of thinking that premise 2 is actually a problem for this argument is to say, look, you just take too narrow a view of the epistemic benefits. Like, it doesn't have to be that it advances the argument immediately. Something more like, in having to engage with it, you actually uncover the grounds of your belief. So are there any other people who are imprudent and engage with strangers and friends on the internet about things? Yeah, you are. Yeah, you say that seems like right. So what has your experience ever been like at the end? Oh, even if you don't change your mind, oh, like my reason for holding that view was actually garbage. It was a trash reason. No? Maybe I'm just prone to excessive self-doubt. But I often, like, even if I preserve the sense that I'm right as to the conclusion, engaging with other people all the time, even people like who I think have crazy views, leaves me with the impression that, like, now I understand my own view better. That's an epistemic benefit that just gets washed out in a lot of these considerations, right? I mean, I think a lot of the times we get the views that we get from family and socioeconomic circumstance. We don't really know why we have them, but we know that we have to defend them and that everyone else has to be wrong. I don't know. So I'm persuaded, in part at least, by this Millian idea that, like, for a lot of us, those truths, even if they really are true, they're dead dogmas. We don't hold them in any meaningful sense. Like, we'll vote the right way if we get to vote because they happen to be true, but we don't really understand, and that's a problem to not understand.
Well, I guess my problem with this is that democratic self-government seems like a very concrete concept, whereas epistemic value is incredibly subjective, in my opinion, because who really determines what is of value and what isn't?
Oh, okay, so that's actually an important thing to note. So to be of epistemic value is just to be conducive to producing true statements, or something like that.
But how do you know what is true, I guess?
We look at the world. Like,
but everyone has a different truth, so there is no real...
No. So lots of people disagree.
I don't think there's one truth.
Oh, there's totally one truth. No, because, okay, so take a really simple case where people disagree about something like the shape of the Earth.
Okay. Yeah.
Okay? Like, people disagree. But do they have different truths? No, I'm Kyrie Irving of the Boston Celtics, and I hold that the Earth is flat. This is something that's true, and it's a disgrace among our team.
But it has epistemic value to disagree with that.
Oh, sure. So that's what I was saying, is it's easy.
It does promote it.
Well,
even
not
if
anymore,
what you're saying is flawed.
It might have
Right.
had epistemic value of like Aristotle, but at this point I think
Well, so I think these two things are compatible. So what you said at first, I'm just disagreeing with the we all have our own truths thing first, and then I'll take the epistemic value thing separate. So if it's true that we all have our own truths, then for you the Earth is round, and for Kyrie Irving the Earth is flat, and objectively it's neither flat nor round. There's no fact of the matter. Like that's we don't want to go that way. That's like extreme relativism. Good. Okay. So.
But okay, just to like add on to that for a second, like Casey, you said like, oh, the Earth is round. Okay, tell me scientifically why the Earth is round.
why the
Oh, we know the Earth is round.
well one,
because
we've
of
seen
the
pictures of it.
Okay, what if the government made up those pictures?
Well, so sure, you can produce.
Conspiracy.
Okay, it's not
What
like
determines a conspiracy?
aside from like the pictures of it necessarily, like it's pretty hard once you get into it to demonstrate like scientifically why the Earth is round.
Okay, but have you ever been in an airplane? There's a curvature to the Earth that you can
Okay, but
see
a
with
lot
your
of
own
people
two
have
eyes.
not been in an airplane. Just because I've been in an airplane and I've seen it doesn't mean that when I'm trying to explain to someone who hasn't been in an airplane, they have the same point of
Well,
view.
but okay, but we accept. Hold on, but.
And I think that that's valuable.
But totally, so
Being a
totally.
molecule
But what we're learning right
I
now,
believe they exist.
what we're learning right now, and I think this is really important, is that we accept testimony of other people as evidence for the truth of claims. Like, we're disagreeing about something which, like, we shouldn't be disagreeing about because the Earth is round. But it's been valuable, I think, because we at least learned that testimony is a form of evidence, that you can believe something and have justification for believing it on the basis of testimony. Now, it's not infallible. Sometimes people lie in their testimony. Sometimes there are government conspiracies. The government put poison in liquor during Prohibition and killed people. Lots of bad things happen, but in general, we accept testimony as evidence, and that means that we're not just all living in separate worlds. Yeah.
Well, I was going to say, yes, the Earth is round. But I don't think people that dissent from that opinion, I don't think that their opinion holds no value.
Right. So that's a separate
so I guess
question.
that's what my question is. How do we determine what ideals are valuable or not?
So, and I think that part of what I was trying to say is that this might take a very narrow view of epistemic value, right? If you've got more true claims, you've got more epistemic value, right? But sometimes epistemic value is produced when you understand better the grounds of your belief. So we just uncovered that for most of us, the grounds of our belief that the Earth is round are like pictures from the telescopes, experiences in planes, and the testimony of lots of smart people, right? That's something that we might not have thought about before. There's epistemic value there. So painting this with a sufficiently broad brush, maybe this isn't so bad. Maybe it is. I think I'm at time and there's lunch. Thanks. The Earth